Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar presented by Srang Skills Development Institute, Toronto, Canada. This is the fourth webinar of the 100th webinar series of Public Education and Awareness Nature on the significance and importance of laws, rules, regulations, and best practices for hotels and accommodation industry. My name is Aziz Ahmed Hayat and I will be your facilitator, presenter for today's webinar. No matter the type of accommodation, country, location, the room rate, the hotel and accommodation businesses are all governed by laws and regulations, both by country laws and international laws. All the owners and operators must follow these rules and regulations as they share similar guidelines all over the world. By knowing these rules and regulations, you can protect your business from negligence, improper service, from major liabilities like fines and punishments. As per the Ministry of Tourism, Pakistan, the number of foreigners who visited Pakistan has increased 100% in 2019 as compared to 2018, which has increased the demand for infrastructure like hotels, restaurants, tour operators, transportations, and has created job opportunities and opportunities for wealth creation. At the same time, the challenges are also increased to meet and match the expectations of international tourists. Accommodation and hotel businesses are more sensitive and more demanding than any other business, as we have to deal with many traditions, many nationalities, different values, and different expectations of the guests. However, there are some common expectations, like want to have a safe and secure environment, better quality clean accommodation, easy and safe transportation system, and diverse kind of products where they can enjoy and they can have a value for money. Customer service is very important. They want to have a better and homely customer services, and of course the food is the most important amongst all. Sometimes the language barriers, they want to have an interpreter so they can understand in their own language, and there is somebody to tell them to understand the things better in their own language. It was becoming difficult to manage the subject in one webinar, so I decided to make it in three parts. In the first part, we will be discussing the laws, rules, and regulations. In the second part, we will be discussing the key elements for establishing a code of conduct and code of ethics. And the third part, we will be discussing the code of conduct for management and employees. The hospitality laws, rules, regulations, and best practices have an special significance and importance in the design and operations of hotels and accommodation business. These laws were created to ensure that hotels, motels, restaurants, and other public accommodations are providing safe, secure environment and take all measures to safeguard their customers, suppliers, and staff. The guests staying in hotels or in any other accommodation are expecting a good night stay free from any type of harm. They should be protected from any type of criminal activity such as robbery, assault, and their belongings are protected as well. There are many types of laws, hospitality laws, but one thing is very common is that the customers' rights and safeties are taken care. We will only be focusing on few important hospitality laws and standards, including the Hotel Motel Fire Safety Act, the Truth in Meno law, accessibility standards, drugs and weapons, emergency preparedness, OSHA, WAMUS, and environmental management. Similarly, we have laws, regulation, and best practices which regulates the restaurants and kitchen operations business to ensure that the food served by restaurants are safe for human consumption. This is not only the legal obligation, but there is also an ethical and universal ethics involved in hotels and motels and restaurant businesses. One of the important act, regulation or law which is catching the international attention, the accessibility law, standards and best practices. This regulation establishes accessibility standards for customers, suppliers, visitors, employees, and it applies to every designated public sector organization, including accommodation and hotel businesses. It established policies, practices, procedures for every provider of goods and services, and shall establish policies, practices, and procedures governing the provision of its goods or services appropriate to persons with disabilities. The organizations shall also be responsible to make all efforts to ensure that the policies, practices, and procedure are consistent with the standards of laws and regulations. This law or act also requires the goods or services providers to provide in a manner that they respect the dignity and independence of the person with disabilities is not impacted. One of the important factor or element of this act is the training of staff. They should be properly trained to discharge their duties supporting the person with disabilities. It is also important for the designers, developers, engineers, investors to ensure that the design, commissioning and post-commissioning phases, they apply the Disability Act. The famous Disability Act is American Disability Act. This act covers the purpose and application, scope, effective dates, establishment of policies, practices and procedures, notice of temporary disruptions, training for staff, feedback process, compliance, accessibility report, and authorities and agencies responsible for implementing this act. Please stay tuned to our next webinar on National Fire Protection Act, and a very important act, and it is a mandatory for all the hotels and accommodation businesses to implement this act to ensure the safety of public, the guests, employees, visitors, suppliers, and everybody. Stay tuned for our next webinar. Have a blessed and happy day. अल्लाह सुब्हान व तआला आप सबको अपने हिफ्ज़ व अमान में रखे. आमीन.